and Non Onabiala, which means welcome. So welcome to Africa Day. This is a very special day for African Interest Group because this is a day we celebrate being African. Africa is a continent of 54 countries, 54 wonderful countries. So we're here representing a cross-border of people of African descent who are here to celebrate African Day. Africa is the second largest continent in the world. That means a lot. So we're here to discuss, to dialogue, to talk about topical issues such as COVID-19. According to Financial Times, Africa was on high alert after the reported first case in Egypt with regards to COVID-19. After the alert, Africans became careful and became wary of the pandemic. Thankfully, or more or less, I'll say in a good way, the pandemic hasn't dealt with Africa as it has dealt with other continents or other people. What are the reasons? The reasons are quite different from different people. Different statistics have different reasons for why Africa hasn't suffered so much like other parts of the world. So today we're going to talk about creating conducive conditions for Africans' development and intensifying the fight against COVID-19 pandemic. It's with pleasure we're going to have this conversation. With pleasure we have this conversation in partnership with International Economic Law Interest Group of the American Society of International Law. The panelists today are Mrs. Funke Adekoya, Professor Kelechi Kalu, Ms. Warimu Karanja, and Professor Olabisi Akinkwe. We apologize for the unforeseen circumstance of one of the panelists, Alex, who was meant to join us, but he couldn't for some reason. I'll have to introduce the lead speaker. The lead speaker is the role model to lots of people, including myself. She's done formidable things. According to Who is Who Legal, Funke Adekoya is recognized as a thought leader 2021, which says she's an outstanding lawyer who is extremely knowledgeable and professional. Funke Adekoya, Senior Advocate of Nigeria, is a leading lawyer on the continent and one of the foremost female arbitrators in Africa. She heads the arbitration practice group at LX. LX is a full-service law firm with offices in Nigeria, which includes Lagos, Port Harcourt, Abuja, and Accra, Ghana. With 45 years experience in commercial dispute resolution, she's frequently appointed to arbitral tribunals, either as a sole or party-appointed arbitrator, conducting proceedings under the rules of ICC, ICSID, UNCITRAL, and Lima arbitration, in which she has been involved in a range of disputes arising from gas sales agreements, oil rig supply contracts, to joint ventures in construction and real estate. She's a fellow and has achieved chartered arbitrator status at the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, London, and has served as the chair of the Nigerian branch. Funke is listed on various panels, including the ICSID Chairman's Panel of Arbitrators, those of CITEC, the Kigali International Arbitration Center, and the Lagos Regional Center for International Arbitration, including the Lagos Regional Center for International Commercial Arbitration, and the panel of neutrals of both Lagos Multi-Door Courthouse and the Nigerian Communications Commission. Funke Adekoya holds both Nigerian and British nationality, and in addition to her being called to the Nigerian bar, she is qualified as a solicitor in England and Wales. She holds an LLM from the Harvard Law School and was elevated to the rank of the Senior Advocate of Nigeria in 2001. Funke Adekoya is regarded as one of the brightest minds on the continent, and with pleasure, I welcome her to give us her leading talk. She's going to feature on three main areas, which are: what do we mean by development? Economic, political, and social. The second arm will be how to create these conducive conditions. Thirdly, the impact of the pandemic on conducive conditions for development and what to do about intensifying the fight against COVID-19. With honor and pleasure, I welcome Funke Adekoya to lead the conversation. Thank you.
Hello. Ekaso. Ẹ kúrọ̀lẹ́ o, gbogbo ẹ̀yin àgbáyé tẹ́ ń fetí gbọ́ ìtàn sọ́nsìn. I have spoken in Yoruba, which is my native tongue, and I have said good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are listening wherever you are in the world. I'd like to start by thanking the Africa Interest Group and the American Society for International Law for inviting me to be the lead speaker at this event. And I do not intend to give a lecture, because what I've been told is that it's a conversation, and I intend to keep it that way. What I'd like to do is to highlight some pertinent issues that are relevant to the topic, much in the context of I am the hostess. You're all invited to a meal, which is a very African event. And I'm laying the table. So I'll set the place mats and put the cutlery, and I will provide the main meal. And I will leave it to the panelists either to carve up the main meal as they see fit, throw it away, or provide trimmings for it, or even dessert. That's the way I intend to go. Lawyers always start with definitions, and I think it would serve us right and give us some grounding if I actually did start with the definition. So I think we really ought to start with what do we mean when we say Africa's development? Noting that we are discussing development against the context of international law, I think the best place to start is the United Nations Declaration on the Right to Development. That declaration was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1986, so 35 years ago. And the declaration stated, and I'm going to quote, it says that everyone is, quote, entitled to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development, in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized. And then Article 3 of the Declaration states again, states have the primary responsibility for the creation of national and international conditions favorable to the realization of the right to development. So the declaration is unequivocal. It establishes development as a right. It puts people at the center of the development process. Now, I will not go into discussions as to whether that declaration has been effective or ineffective. Some academic scholars, and I'm very aware of the fact that I'm sitting in the middle of two professors, have taken views that, oh, this declaration is not worth the paper it's written on. It is vague, it's unenforceable, it's aspirational. Rather, what I'd like us to look at are the aspects of that declaration that I think are especially relevant to Africa, which is economic development, political development, and social development. And as I say, I'm a lawyer. I love to define everything and make sure that people understand what I'm talking about. So I'm looking at economic development as a change in a country's economy that can be measured qualitatively and quantitatively, some improvements. And usually they are determined either by way of gross domestic product or per capita income, the level of infrastructural development, the level of market growth, but they are things that can be measured in some form or the other. But can these measurements be deceptive? The World Bank figures, for instance, show that Angola, which is an oil-rich country, as is Nigeria, in 2019, it had a GDP per capita of $2,790. Nigeria had a GDP per capita of even less, about $2,200. This is an oil-rich economy. And so there is an extent to which one could wonder when we are measuring what we mean by economic development as to how those figures match up with what we see on the ground. If you look at some countries, it will classify them as, oh, it's a rich country because they have this amount of annual revenue. But if you look at the same country in some other aspect, it's classified as a very poor country because the level of their population, access to resources, access to the general indices of life are very, very low. So that is economic development, measured by things that you can see and supposedly that have improved over the years in terms of the country's economy. What do we mean by political development? I would say that political development translates to what academics and development theorists refer to as good governance. And for me, good governance means exactly what those words are, good governance. Governance that is in the interests and works for the benefit of the governed. In some aspects, some people say good governance is democracy. So do we mean that a stable system of participatory government where the needs of the citizens are met must be a democracy? Is good governance equivalent to democracy? And in terms of democracy, everybody talks about one man, one vote. So is universal suffrage a sign of democracy? And does universal suffrage equate to good governance? If we're looking at just universal suffrage and democracy and the right to vote, then let's just go back in history a little bit. Canada and Australia. Until the 1960s, their indigenous populations did not have the right to vote. But these countries are held up worldwide as examples of a democratic system of government and good governance. Let's go to what in Africa for many countries is the motherland, England, former colonial power. Up to the 19th century, the right to vote depended on property rights. You had to be a landowner, you had to own property before you could vote. And even going to the 20th century, women could not vote in England until 1918. And even then in 1918, it was linked to the woman must have property. It was only in 1928 that the universal right to women to vote without any restrictions came into being by their legislation. So when we are talking about good governance, I think we need to decide whether we are equating good governance with democracy, and if we are, what type of democracy? And I'll come back to that in a bit. Then let's look at social development. What do we mean? For me, social development is improving the well-being of the citizen, of every individual in society, so that they have access or they have an opportunity to reach their full potential. The success of the society should be linked to the well-being of each and every citizen. So anything that is in place that allows each citizen to have an opportunity to improve, to have a better life, to access resources that are available if he or she wishes to do so, to me is a sign of the social development level of that country. So having defined what I mean by development, what are the legal frameworks that exist? For Africa, there is a legal framework that guarantees the right to development, and that's the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. It does exist. And I'm going to quote Article 22 of the African Charter because I think that is the relevant article. And it says, all peoples shall have the right to their economic, social, and cultural development with due regard to their freedom and identity, and in the equal enjoyment of the common heritage of mankind. And it goes on and it says, states shall have the duty, individually or collectively, to ensure the exercise of the right to development. So where I take it from this is that you cannot have sustainable development without peace, without stability, without human rights, without effective governance, all based on the rule of law. But let's move forward a bit. Whose duty is it to fulfill the right to development? What type of obligations fall under it? For the African Charter, which is relevant for African countries, it's clear. States have the primary responsibility to create, and I quote again, national and international conditions favorable to the realization of the right to development. So that fundamental obligation for development is an obligation of the state as an entity. And it lies with each and every national government in Africa. And I note that all countries in Africa have signed the Banjul Treaty, this African Charter. So it's binding on everyone. So having said that, what is the present state of Africa's development? In terms of economic development, breaking news is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It looks at trade liberalization in Africa. If it works, then a rising tide lifts all ships. All African economies will benefit from trade liberalization. But there are some issues we need to consider. Because African countries were former colonies, the development of the economies of those countries were focused on supplying raw materials to the colonial master. And in many instances, the infrastructure in those countries was built to ensure that natural resources could easily get to where it could be exported to the motherland. And therefore, one of the problems that we will see with the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is the lack of transportation links between African countries. The tendency is that most roads are built leading to a seaport for export out of Africa. The road links that will take me and my goods from Nigeria to Togo, to Cameroon, to Ghana, that will take me from Nigeria through to Rwanda, through to Tanzania. African states need to be thinking about it. And if we say the road links are a long shot, what about the air links? Nigeria is a hub for airline travel, as is Nairobi, as is South Africa, as is Addis Ababa. And the two major airlines in Africa are probably Ethiopian Airlines and South African Airways. But it is probably easier for me to get to Chad from Lagos by flying to Paris and then flying from Paris back to Chad than a direct flight from Lagos to Chad. It's probably faster and possibly cheaper for me to get to Addis Ababa by flying to London or Dubai and then flying down to Addis Ababa or Nairobi than a direct flight between Lagos and Nairobi. So these are the things that we need to think about if we want to ensure that economic development is implemented under the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Then let's look at the information age, where we are now, the digital age. That is something that also will contribute to African development. And it is something in which the COVID-19 pandemic has actually had a beneficial influence. Because of the lockdowns that have cropped up over many African countries during the period of the lockdown, people have turned or have acknowledged the digital age and the use of technology in communication, both within country and outside country. I wouldn't have been able to participate in this event today if not for the use of digital technology. But at a very basic level, we're even looking at things such as fintech. The fact that a lot of people have now been able to access money wallets online, transferring funds online, buying groceries online. So the use of online logistics, blockchain technology has come into, so COVID has done something beneficial for Africa in highlighting the advantages that this digital age can provide and which a lot of people have made use of. Supermarkets have put their stores online so that you go on a laptop or a mobile phone, you buy what you need, and there's a logistics carrier, a little man on a motorcycle with a little basket behind him who comes to deliver to your house. So to that, there has actually been a boost in the economy as a direct result of COVID-19. And because there has been this boost in terms of the use of technology, the use of fintech especially, what we have seen is that we then have offshore investors who are willing to put money into these new ventures. So this is something that has happened directly as a result of COVID that has boosted some aspects of economic development. Now, what about political development? Not so rosy. As I said initially, are we saying political development is equivalent to democracy? I say no. My view is that it is good governance that is key. It is not democracy that is key. Many African countries say they are democratic. Their leaders are installed by elections. But there's a hue and cry as to how those elections are conducted, how the votes are counted, how people stand for elections. And so what we would probably say, or what I would say, and I'm glad that I'm on the internet and so the effects are being thrown, none are going to touch me, is that we do not have democracy in Africa. We have either military or civilian dictatorships, or we have what I would say is a non-participatory democracy. And this itself is a disincentive to African development and African economic growth. But having said that, what type of democracy is being pushed at us? Because we are all recent spectators of democracy in the land of democracy, the United States, where the person who won the popular vote did not become president. And if we say that democracy is one man, one vote, you start to wonder the difference between participatory democracy and representative democracy, where in America, it is an electoral college that actually elects the president. So is Western style democracy the answer? At a point in time where our theme for Africa Day 2021 includes culture and heritage, this may be an opportunity for those of us who are legal scholars to go back and look at how African communities and African nations were governed pre-colonial days. Because we did have systems that worked. Call them monarchies, call them theocracies, whatever it is we want to call them, we did have structures that worked. And I know that in my part of Nigeria, we even had traditional structures for removing leaders who did not provide development for their community. Maybe this is the time that we need to go back and look at what our indigenous political systems were, how they worked, and see whether we should build a concept of governance that is indigenous to Africa. Because clearly, in the vast majority of African countries where we say we have democracy, it's not working. Or Western style democracy is not working. Then let's look at social development. I see that I'm running out of time. Social development. There, COVID-19 has actually shown us where we have problems. Healthcare, hospitals and staffing inadequate. Housing, social distancing. It's impossible in Africa. People live so close together, and it's even part of the community, communal living. But this has not helped. And so this is an area in which people, many countries have been deficient. I'm sure that after COVID has come and gone, the World Health Organization will have some sort of study to understand why many African countries have not been as badly hit as was expected by many of us. Third aspect of social development that I think we still have not done as well as we should is employment. We have a growing, massively growing youth population, and the jobs are not there or are not being created. So how do we create these conducive conditions for development? I think we need to invest in internal communication, infrastructure, our roads, our rail, between African countries. Removing the trade barriers, increased use of technology is not enough. We need to be sure that having removed the trade barriers, that the trade can actually move. We need to pivot the use of digital technology into the justice sector such that we can use digital technology to deliver justice at a faster pace. In this note, at this point, I commend Kenya because they have pivoted and used the COVID pandemic to actually deliver rulings, judgments, cases online using digital technology. Nigeria has not been as fast on that as we would have hoped. There've been lots of talk about it. There was some at the initial start of the pandemic, and that has since died down. And now we are getting back into looking at electronic case management systems for our courts. But that is something that will deliver justice and that the COVID pandemic ought to enable us look at. But above all else, what would create the conducive condition for development? Education. 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 It covers all aspects of development. If there's education, people will understand what the right to vote means and will use it wisely and will protect their vote. If there is education, people will be able to understand that they have a right to call legislators to order, to recall them if they are not performing, to call them out if they are misbehaving. If you have education, then it would create opportunities for our youth. I was listening to a podcast on the BBC some days ago, talking about the oil pipeline, the East African oil pipeline that was going to be built. And the fact that in East Africa, the 3 East African countries did not have enough welders and pipe fitters, which means that those jobs are going to be exported to build, to fit the pipeline. If there is education, not just academic education, but skills-based education and technical education, then we would be fitting our youth for a future in which they can live and be self-sufficient. And at this point, I'd like to throw down an issue that I think that our educators should consider. The only book that has been translated, as far as I know, the only book that has been translated into nearly all Nigerian languages is the Bible. Why haven't we translated our science textbooks, our geography books, our social studies books into our indigenous languages? Why are we not teaching in our indigenous languages? One of the world leaders in terms of technology is China. And China teaches science, teaches physics, teaches maths in Chinese, in Mandarin. Therefore, there is something to be said for passing along technology and education in our indigenous languages. And I think that that actually would go against the background of this year's theme, which is arts, culture, and heritage. And that we use our heritage to promote ourselves into the 21st and 22nd centuries by educating in our indigenous languages, not English. In China, English is a second language, and they teach it as a second language. But the rudiments of education for the first 9 years of compulsory education is in Mandarin. And then finally, education of the girl child, because we've got half our labor force that are being relegated as not being so important. Still comes back to education, because when we educate the girl child, then they understand how to take care of themselves when they are pregnant, whether or not they should become pregnant as teenagers. That infant child mother mortality rate will decrease. Possibly the population rate may decrease, all as a result of education. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that development is the focus and should be the focus of Africa. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals highlight development. If you look at the Social Development Goal, I think it's 8 and 16, especially relevant. Goal 8, decent work and economic growth. Goal 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, focusing on peaceful, and I'm quoting, peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. That's what we need to do to ensure that we do have a conducive condition for development in Africa. I've served the main course. I'm sorry, I've slightly gone over my 25 minutes, and I now hand over to the panelists to dissect it, divide it, add the trimmings, or bring the dessert. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Funke Adekoya. I liked what you said about the development, having economic, political, and social. Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, said it correctly. He said, development is not about money or machines or good policies. Rather, it's about real people and the lives they lead. And that ties in nicely to what you just said now. Our next speaker is Professor Kelechi Kalu. He's going to tell us more, going to say more based on what you've talked about. I would like him to also say more on, do we equate good governance to democracy based on what Funke said? Could you highlight more on that? So do we equate good governance to democracy? That'll be a good way to start off. Professor Kelechi Kalu is a professor of political science at the University of California, Riverside. He serves as the founding vice provost of international affairs at the University of California, Riverside, where he was responsible for setting the vision for University of California, Riverside internationalization efforts. He's an active member of a number of international organizations, including NAFSA, AIEA, and IIE. Kalu currently serves on the board of governors for the Congo Basin Institute and the Global Ambassador for Yali, Accra Regional Center. Carlo is widely published and serves as a consultant to the World Bank on public sector governance, to the Asian Development Bank on managing sustainable development in resource-rich countries. He's a co-editor and contributor of West Africa and the US War on Terror. He's also written articles on perspectives on challenges to peace in Africa. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Kelechi Carlo to tell us more about the topic, as well as say more on equating good governance to democracy. Thank you.
Ndebai, ndewono, ijoma imela. Bianu sorom kairi nri Funke Adekoya wuru. Odi nuku. As Ijoma has said, my name is Kelechi Carlo, and I just greeted my people in my Igbo language. And I'm inviting everybody to come and join us in enjoying the meal that Funke Adekoya has just served. So Ijoma wants me to start by clarifying a little bit more about the equation of good governance to democracy. Let me take a step back and go to Sam Huntington. He says the most important political distinction among countries concerns not their form of government, but their degree of government. Not the form, but the degree. So the question there is, to what extent have governments across African countries actually carried out their functions? If they are democracies or non-democracies, what form of economic governance exists in relationship between, for example, the rural farmer, the urban consumer, and the international market? What forms of governance exist within the religious institutions, the traditional institutions, and formal forms of government? What forms of governance exist within our educational institution? So governance is not just about government. It's also about social relationship away from the government. They may have some aspects of leadership structures, authority structures that look like government. Here is the problem, the challenge for us. I agree with the erudite lawyer who has shared with us her perspective on government, on development, social and economic. Let me open up the discussion a little bit more. The state that frames all of these in each African geographic location is not just a colonial structure. The transference of power to the leadership continues to mimic the colonial governance mentality. What we are looking for, as lawyer Adekoya mentioned, are there structures within our indigenous social formations, structures of leadership that we can rely on as a way to transform these arresting formal foreign institutions of governance? I think there are. Whether you are talking about the Yoruba land, or you are talking about the Zulus, or even within the Igbo Council of Elders, or within the Ghanaian Ashanti kingdoms or social formations in Buganda, in Uganda. There are those indigenous systems that can hold the leaders accountable for what they do. Here is my take on governance. The ordinary person in the streets of Kenya, or the person in Kibera, more specifically, when you go to Kibera in Kenya, or the person in Jinja in Uganda, or Kalishiville in South Africa, Ajegule in Nigeria, you name it, everywhere. They are looking for physical safety. Can they move around? Can they go from one point to the other without being molested? The woman is looking for access to clean water. Can she have that without losing her life or her dignity? Does she have access to energy with which to prepare her meals? Can you have a preservation system like refrigeration? In other words, energy. There are things very basic when we talk about development, when we talk about governance. The government's responsibility is to provide security. It's actually not the government responsibility for development. The government responsibility, from my point of view, is to create the enabling environment. The enabling environment that allows for education to thrive. The enabling environment that allows for those entrepreneurial engines of growth to thrive. The artisans. What we are lacking across board is being able to trust that the Tylenol, the Advil you're buying from the store is not fake. What we need is to know that the water we drink is clean, it won't kill us. That what we buy from the market, these are, I'm talking about regulation here. These are the roles government play. When government plays its security role, regulatory roles, and ensures that there is peace and security, development would happen. Our government, when it comes to the issue of COVID, when it comes to, because when we talk about COVID, we are talking about science and technology from my point of view. They have always known the connection between science and technology. You see, people often talk about African countries, and it is true. We have abundant natural resources. Well, those countries with abundant natural resources, but do not have effective state or management institutions of their resources and people, these people have no advantage over those without natural resources. Effective management. At independence, our government attempted to do that. For example, if you think about Ghana, way back in 1960, the Ghanaians established the Research Council, 1959, the Ghanaian Research Council. Nigeria followed suit in 1966 with the National Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. Kenya, the National Council for Science and Technology, was established in the late 1970s. You can see there were proliferations of higher education institutions. They understood the connection. Indeed, in the Monrovia Declaration, 1979, African heads of state and representatives all agree that they have to harness their resources towards using science and technology for development of the continent. They reaffirmed this commitment in the Lagos Plan of Action. Lagos Plan of Action that happened in 1980. But they went further. They charged each government to develop a national science and technology policy. They have always known the connection. They even go further because out of the Lagos Plan of Action, which metamorphosed into the new Partnership for Economic Development, NEPAD. They went further to say, let's do this continentally, because working together, we will develop our countries and therefore our continent. So here's the question. Where did the rain begin to beat us? When did we lose sight of the fact that science, which is not necessarily only formal Western science, in Igbo we say dibia. What is dibia? Dibia is doctor. In Yoruba you say babalawo. What is babalawo? These are medical doctors, they herbalists, they are scientists. How do we harness science to ensure that we can develop at the level and specific to our different communities? These are the challenges the government face. So this is what I suggest where the rain began to beat us. It began to beat us when our leaders, in some of my publications, I call them settler elites. When they started listening to outsiders, to World Bank, to IMF, to foreign advisors, mainly at the expense of indigenous scientists, communities, when they began to neglect funding for education, that's when the rain hit us hard. One of the person responsible for development of the Pfizer vaccine is a Nigerian. And yet, in Nigeria, we don't have these Pfizer vaccines available. We wait for outsiders to tell us what to do. We look for models from outside. Why are we doing that? Permit me for a second, because I just finished doing some research that should be coming out shortly. Here is what McKinsey report says. At least 400 companies earn revenues in Africa, earn revenues above $1 billion. And that nearly 700 companies have annual revenue greater than 500 million. And yet the misperception of Africa as weak remains. Here's another data. The African and foreign-owned companies with combined revenue of $1.4 trillion in 2015 have grown faster than their peers in the rest of the world in local currency terms and are more profitable than their global peers in most sectors. Where are these resources? When you talk about governance, you have to think about what kind of institutions exist in the economic sector. More specifically, what kind of institutions exist in the border between a specific country and the outside world? Africans trade more with non-Africans than we do. So the reason I had to go back to mention Lagos Plan of Action, the Monrovia Declaration, and so many other declarations, we have been having this. I am optimistic about the Africa free trade, but I have to see it to believe it. This is not new. When we think about what COVID has done, it has exposed the inequity. It has exposed the absence of an effective policy. You see, it didn't hit Africans as much as was predicted, precisely because of the failure of development. Yes, the connecting links road is a national security issue. When you build effective roads connecting the communities, you are not just building economic engine between rural and urban and suburban. You are building a security platform that allows the police and the military and other security forces to move about. You look across many African countries, as Funke mentioned, most of your roads and your railways are still reflecting the colonial mentality. We need to connect to the rural areas. That's where development has to happen. That lack of development served us well this time because the mobility constrained by policies in the US, in France, in Britain, and others, the absence of people traveling back and forth reduced the potential for COVID-19 impacting us in our own communities. But those that had it, because of bad roads, they were quarantined, they couldn't move back and forth. That's part of what saved us. Is that good? Not necessarily so. Not if you are not looking at the other dimension of development or underdevelopment by our own leaders. Look at agriculture. We are importing food in excess of 10% of our GDP. In Nigeria, just last year alone, you spent over 1.2 billion or so importing food. That is disgraceful. Because with development, with connecting the link between the rural and the urban, with safety, physical safety for everybody, you will be able to produce the kind of food that will first and foremost feed us before we begin to think about exporting. If you travel from Kampala to Gulu, at some point, you will see massive land, agricultural land. But those are owned by foreigners. You come to Kenya, many of the roses and flowers that we are enjoying out here are produced there. Why not produce food? So the policies we have are not adequate for our need. The management systems we have are not adequate for our needs. If an individual is healthy, that individual makes for a healthy family. The healthy family makes for a healthy community society, and on and on. But the government has to play its part. Keep us from killing each other. Protect us, make sure that the lawyers, the judges, everybody is accountable to the law, the rule of law, not the rule of men and women. There has to be a platform that enables us to go back to a very important point that my sister made. Our indigenous language is not just China. I have traveled extensively across China, and I have gone to their laboratories and seen what she's talking about. Think about South Korea, always compared to Nigeria. In South Korea, the way General Park did it, if you're manufacturing this, you have to put instructions in Korean. Anything you manufacture, because everyone speaks Korean. They wanted the woman in the kitchen to be able to read instructions. If it's a stove, she has to be able to understand. If it is medicine, she has to be able to understand what that medicine is supposed to do. And in terms of diplomacy, the fact that they translate allows them opportunity to think and strategically know when to weigh in. Us Africans, with the exception of sometimes my brothers and sisters from East Africa, we like to speak the English language more than the British themselves. We like to speak the French more than the French themselves. That is to our disadvantage, not an advantage in any shape or form. Because much of what we need are in our indigenous languages and culture. The question is, how do we retrieve them to cure us of social ills political ills, economic ills, so that we can be fully who we are meant to be by whoever created us. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelechi, for that. Thanks a lot. Thank you. There's so many questions, but I'll be doing the Q&A session. Moving on, our next speaker is Warimu Karanja. Warimu Karanja is the director of Warimu & Co. A Nairobi-based practice which provides specialist legal and policy advice, research, and training in areas of corporate law, energy, and natural resources, investment and trade matters in Kenya and internationally. Warimu has 12 years experience and previously worked in leading Kenyan and international law firms. She has advised private sector and development organizations on various projects in Africa relating to electricity generation, transmission and trade, oil and gas, mining. She has also advised on private equity, mergers and acquisition, immigration, employment, and IP. Warimu is recognized in Who is Who Legal 2021 rankings as a future leader in arbitration. She holds a master's degree in energy, law, and policy. It's my pleasure to welcome Warimu Karanja. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ijeoma. It is a pleasure to be here. I am thankful to Asil and especially to Ijeoma for the invitation to be part of this incredible panel. I feel very humbled and very honored to be seated with my mentor, Mrs. Funke Adekoya, and Kelechi Kalu Olabisi, well-renowned professors. Mrs. Funke is a mentor to many, and I've really enjoyed your opening remarks, Mrs. Funke. Funke is among the few African arbitrators who have been appointed in ICSID arbitrations, which is the holy grail of international arbitration in Africa. So I really do look up to her. Now, we are having a conversation about creating...
Sorry, could you welcome us in your Kenyan language, please? Say it, please.
Asante sana for reminding me. Thank you. Habari zenu, jambo, karibu, nashukuru kuwa hapa. That is Kiswahili for how are you? Hello, I am thankful to be here. Kiswahili is the main language in Kenya and in East Africa, and also an African Union language. I have another language called Kikuyu. I am a Kikuyu, and I will say Muriega, which is how are you doing? So thank you for reminding me. I think I was overwhelmed by the speeches that went before mine. So as I was thinking about today, Africa Day, and celebrating Africa Day, I went to the AU website and looked at, some of what has been discussed on Africa Day. And the theme is arts, culture, and heritage. And one of the questions that I asked myself is, why arts, culture, and heritage as the levers to build Africa, especially now when we are in a post or in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, in the middle of anti-globalization efforts by various countries. We saw that in the US from 2016. So why that? Why not resilience? Why not building ourselves from the economic downturn? Why not adaptation? Why arts, culture, and heritage? And there are various quotes that have been written there by Miriam Makeba, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and the one that really resonated with me was Fela Kuti, whose quote was, "I must identify myself with Africa, then I will have an identity." And in his Africa Day speech, AU Commission Chairperson Musa Faki Mahamat said, Africa, and I quote, "Africa can only assert itself in multilateralism and partnerships with the rest of the world by affirming without complex or overshadowing its being, its personality, and its identity on the basis of total equality with others. And that is what has formed the basis, I think, of what Mrs. Funke has opened up the discussion on and what Professor Kelechi has continued to speak about. So I'm going to follow Mrs. Funke's speech and Kelechi's speech on economic development, political development, social development, and my focus will mostly be on the investment in technology and the young people of Africa. Now, COVID, as Kelechi said, the rain started beating us on so many things. Africa, you cannot start to talk about Africa. But COVID has, even though it has not caused as many deaths, of course, every life is precious, has really caused an economic downturn in very many African countries. And Professor Kelechi, you put it quite squarely that part of what the pandemic brought out, and a friend of mine also told me at the beginning of, in early 2020, when we were beaming with pride about how the world does not understand that Africans are healthy and Africans know how to use traditional medicine. And he said, my friend said exactly what Professor Kelechi said, that this shows exactly how disconnected Africa is from the rest of the world. And within Africa, how disconnected we are, the fact that people you can disappear as a peoples, you can disappear as a continent, and the world just continues moving because of the transportation links, because of the air links, because of the train links between the different countries. That is why COVID spread so much in Europe and not so much in Africa. And I'll give you a local example. I live in Nairobi. The traffic in Nairobi is very bad. I stay in a bubble. If I need to visit somebody in Karen, I am going to plan a day ride. I am going to have snacks and supplies because I know I will spend 5 hours in traffic to go to a meeting or to go and visit a friend. So how do we resolve the problems? How do we create a conducive conditions for development post the COVID-19 pandemic? When it comes to economic development, Africa was really affected. In Kenya, our GDP dropped by 0.4%. World Bank estimates that we had 2 new million people go to extreme poverty because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is because we import almost everything, especially for China. So once that supply link was cut, we had an unemployment rate that went through the roof. Everybody closed down, small businesses closed down, and the government was really at a loss as to what to do about the country when it came to lockdown. How do we go back to the GDP that we were enjoying and the development that we were enjoying? Now, Mrs. Funke talked about economic development and what that means. According to the government of Kenya, economic development is achieving Vision 2030, achieving, according to the World Bank, middle income status by the year 2030, having a huge road network, having a huge rail network. And right now, our public debt is at $70 billion. It is unsustainable. What does development mean for the mwananchi, the person who is the regular man or woman on the ground? That means being able to have decent housing, being able to eat 3 square meals a day at the very least, having a steady job or a business, being able to take your children to school, And most importantly, as we've seen from what's been going on in Kenya, it's not being heavily taxed. Kenyans are heavily taxed either through income taxes that are, 30%, ranging all the way up to 30% of income. And on top of that, you add value-added tax of 16%, including on very many essential items. Bread, milk, a lot of people have complained about that. Now, how do we resolve the issue? It's not about economic stimulus, it's about better public spending, which goes to political development, good governance. How we achieve better public spending is good governance. What I find very admirable about my Kenyan people and a lot of East African people is access to the internet, access to data. Millions of people own smartphones, and that has really invigorated the democratic agenda in Kenya. I will give you an example of when in earlier this month, there was the World Bank spring meetings, and there was a discussion on Facebook Live about the general state of the world economy. And Kenyans on Twitter, or KOT as they are called, just hammered the Facebook accounts and the Twitter accounts of the World Bank, saying, do not lend more money to Kenya. And that has caused a lot of, perhaps not the World Bank, but a lot of development partners rethink the kind of relationships they have with the government of Kenya. And that also put our politicians on notice that any person with a smartphone, be they in Kibera or be they in the rural areas, is going to put them to task. We are now going through a constitutional review process called the Building Bridges Initiative, or BBI. And the government that was the proponent of the Building Bridges Initiative, again, was surprised that there were very many petitions to stop the Building Bridges Initiative that was felt to be a backdoor initiative to change the constitution without going through the proper channels, and an independent judiciary said the process has to stop. That shows how far the country has come from where we were before. And that's one of the things that makes me very happy to be Kenyan, the fact that whether you're right or you're wrong, through your phone, through constitutional petitions, you at least have a voice. That is not to say that we do not have, an imagined democracy, as Mrs. Funke said, but I see the changes that are going on, especially with the young population. Now, when it comes to social development, we have had health issues, but one of the things that I see has really worked in social development in the area of health that I think should continue to work is, again, digitization. We now have close to 1 million Kenyans vaccinated, having had their first vaccine of the AstraZeneca vaccine, the first jab. And the Ministry of Health has a database. And as soon as my mother was vaccinated, before she got out of the vaccination place, she got a text, an SMS from the Ministry of Health telling her that you've been vaccinated and your next vaccination date is X. There needs to be more access to information, especially with health, to quell the vaccine apathy and the healthcare apathy that is in the country right now. When it comes to housing, we have a huge problem that needs to be resolved. Kenya has one of the biggest slums in Africa, Kibera. It has become a tourist attraction in Kenya. People will come and go to Kibera, but it is not something that we should be proud of. It should be something that we should try to change. There are very many housing projects by the government that have been started, but they need to be worked on harder, because one of the reasons why there is spread of the pandemic and spread of the disease and the dire consequences that come from it is bad hygiene, bad housing, poor aeration, and that needs to be resolved. When it comes to employment, we had a huge unemployment slump due to the COVID-19 pandemic. There needs to be better projects for youth employment and youth entrepreneurship. And what's very encouraging in Kenya is, again, connecting it to technology, the fact that there are very many digital projects by the Ministry of ICT that assist youth in entrepreneurship programs. As to whether they are going to achieve the purpose, because some of them are very short-lived, I cannot speak to that, but there is quite a bit of work being done by both the government and development partners and NGO. Education. Education is, again, like Mrs. Funke said, one of the things that is going to propel Africa to be more self-aware, to have an identity, and to be more developed. My country has made strides in education in offering free primary education, but because of corruption or whatever you call it, free laptops were not provided to school children at the rate that they were going to be provided. And how that came out is due to the COVID-19 pandemic, when children had to learn from home, and then everybody realized actually nobody has a free laptop to learn. And in educating the girl child, the country has gone a long way, but more needs to be done, especially in social education when it comes to certain social norms that make girls feel that they do not have a right to education, or they do not have a right to chase their dreams. That being said, I will end it on a happy note that one of the proud moments that we have had in Kenya is the fact that we have our first female Chief Justice. The Deputy Chief Justice is female. The Registrar of the court is female. And that is not to say that we do not value men, but for the young girl in the village, or for me as a young professional, seeing, a court that is more than 50% women is very encouraging. Seeing a parliament that is more than 30% women is very encouraging. And I have come with good news that there is good things happening in Kenya, good things happening in Africa, really, but more needs to be done, especially when it comes to access to information, access to technology, because technology is the future, and more needs to be done to achieve good governance. With good governance, we could have more vaccines. With good governance, we would have more hospital beds so that people are not dying of diabetes or heart conditions because there are no hospital beds. And that's the health crisis that is in Kenya and that is in Africa. So with that, I will end my short intermission and hand it over to you, Ijeoma.
Thank you, Arimo. Thanks a lot for that. So much to chew on. Because of time, we're going to head straight to the next speaker. With his permission, I'm unable to read out his entire bio, which is quite impressive. But I have to say that Professor Labisi D. Akinkwe is the co-founding editor of Afronomicslaw.org blog, which focuses on all aspects of international law as they relate to the African continent. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Labisi Akinkwe. Thank you.
Ejama Oshegon, so to just keep with your theme, Ekaso, it's afternoon here in Halifax, Nova Scotia, so that's good afternoon. And to those who are participating, I say to you, Eku Suru, thank you very much for your patience with us, those who are attending. So it's a great day to be able to talk with persons of the diversity and caliber on the panel. So Mrs. Adekoya ICN, I knew from practice in Nigeria and as a younger lawyer to be able to see how much she has continued to do for not just the girl child, for men and women alike. Is a strong model. So thank you very much, Mrs. Adekoya. And to Professor Kalu and to Wairimo, thank you very much. It's just a great time to have this conversation about the continent and the very many countries we care so much about. I'm conscious of time, so in this type of online events, I'm weary of people's fatigue, so hence the request not to read my bio, and will keep my reflections even shorter. But a lot has been put on the table, I think, by both Mrs. Adekoya, Kelechi and Wairimo. And I do think that my role in this as a last speaker is to somewhat connect them, but also push further questions for food for thought. So Wairimo, gender is a big thing. Mrs. Adekoya said that. And so there's no need to be apologetic at all, I would say, about the man in the image of political party and governance regime on the continent of Africa. It's almost always the case that women are left at the doors or far from those corridors of power in decision-making processes. So to see what is happening in Kenya and what has for some time now been happening in the courts of Lagos State, particular in terms of representation in the judiciary by women, it is a great one. So I think that one good thing to think of is, as I prepared my longer talk, which I won't be able to do, is to ask what was the purpose of coming together to celebrate an African Day, right? And apart from what really crystallized in 1963 when the defunct Organization of African Unity was established, there were a series of movements by way of African Liberation Day that preceded this particular crystallization. And so to quote what the South African government put out today in celebration of today, Africa Day is intended to celebrate and acknowledge the successes of the Organization of African Unity from its creation on May 5th, 1963, in the fight against colonialism, apartheid, as well as the progress that Africa has made while reflecting upon the common challenges that the continent faces in the global environment. I think this is pivotal and important to any conversation that we have in terms of assessing and celebrating African Day. What Mrs. Adekoya's presentation, Mr. Kalu and Ms. Karanja has shown is the fact that how we interpret development, of course, is can be very subjective. There are various measurements by which we can look at the very complex question of development. I teach law and development seminars in universities. And so I do not disagree with you, actually, Mrs. Adekoya, with respect to your arguments around the need to conceptualize or to probe governance and the system of government that we practice. I think it's a contraption. And I think a bigger question we might want to ask, just to engage with your thoughts some more down the line, is whether we really are asking for a world of utopian, where we hope, right, to be able to reverse a lot of the things we've done. Years we used to be under the system we had, as opposed to reimagining within the context of what we have, what can be salvaged. So I liked your description of either, civilian dictatorship on the one hand, or non-participatory democracy on the other hand. And in terms of the political sphere, I do agree with you that all this ties to education, it ties to disincentive, But I think two things I would like to leave on the table, again, conscious of time, with respect to this aspiration of celebrating Africa Day is really one, has the question of colonial legacy. In all the spheres that my fellow panelists have mentioned really stopped. That's a very interesting question because colonialism has not really ended. When we think about the administration of justice, when we think about governance, when we think about the economic practice and the influence of the IMF and the World Bank and these other institutions, even ideologies of thinking, neoliberalism and so on and so forth. So there's a big question. So whether we can really say as a continent comprised of several states with several peoples, that the impact of colonialism has ended is a different thing. And so it begs the question, what are we celebrating as a people, right? What are we accounting for as a people? And that's one part of it. The other part is to ask, who are those that have become complicit in this continuation and perpetuation of colonial legacies today? A lot of our allies on the continent are really to be blamed for this. We could blame colonial establishment before decolonization. Decolonization did not end. I don't think that's contestable. At the time, colonization was achieved by different states. But the way in which it has become entrenched, the way in which it has carried on post-colonialism is a function of how our allies have been very complicit in the process. And so whether you think about those that make themselves to the seats of government at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, they are part of those who have encouraged activities not only by Bretton Woods institutions of the IMF and the World Banks, but also transnational corporations, evasion of taxes, illicit financial flows, and so many other things that has been put on the table today to become very difficult to address. But what COVID-19 has even shown further is how debt, right, the accumulation of debt across many African countries has continued to plunder these countries into very, very dark places with respect to the hope of really planning for tomorrow. I don't think the average Nigerian knows the direct implication of what the government's continued accumulation of debt means for his or her individual life. And so when Mrs. Adekoya speaks about GDP and the quantitative aspects of development, economic development, it has direct correlation to how an individual, right, lives and earns per day. When we think about gender, it has that kind of implication. And I just think that on a day that is supposed to celebrate the fight against colonialism and apartheid, we can celebrate the momentary, acquisition of, territorial sovereignty in terms of political governance, which we can still really question with respect to French-speaking Africa, if we're being honest with ourselves. But at least that exists. But as to the rest, whether there's progress, whether there's a lot that Africa is doing in terms of global environment engagement, what I would say is that the continent, unfortunately, remains a lot at the level of potential promises, whether as represented by the AFCFTA or so many initiatives before now that Professor Kalu has mentioned. I do want to thank you very much for this opportunity to speak, but those are my reflections.
Thank you, Olabisi. Thanks for that. Straight to the point and brief here. So we'll take up the questions at this point. Any Q&A, any questions from the panelists to each other? Do you have any question at all? And to the attendees, please, if you have a question, could you just type it in the Q&A box? Then we'll read it out. Is that okay? Any question from anyone here?
Maybe a comment for Mr. Adekoya to respond to. And the comment is, I completely, like everyone else, agree that education is the foundation. But what kind of education, especially in light of what Olabisi has just said with regard to colonial legacies, many of our curriculum in secondary schools and universities still reflect the transferred curriculum, especially in the field of medicine, in the field of law and government, what came from our colonial area. So are there other nuances perhaps that can help us connect education to the indigenous sector as a development engine? And what I'm thinking about here, one of the things I'm thinking about is location of our educational institutions, more often than not away from the community. I mean, I'm thinking of both secondary schools and higher education institutions that are not really part of the community they are supposed to learn about and therefore be able to help transform.
Thanks for that.
Quick answer to that comment. I'm not an educationist, but I do feel strongly that we would benefit if we actually taught whatever it is we're teaching. If we actually taught in our indigenous languages, I think we'd have better results. I also think that education is global and not local. Science is science, maths is maths, physics is physics. Doesn't matter where you are. My understanding in terms of things like history is that the history that is written is the history of the victors and not the history of the vanquished. And I think we need to look at that and expand that. In terms of geography, I think we need to start with our own geography and not Western Europe and the European Union, that type of geography, which was the geography I learned when I was growing up through school. I also think that education should be not book knowledge only. We pay lip service to technical education. We pay lip service to skills transfer. And I think we need to provide education that will equip our people for gainful employment, whether it is technical education, agricultural education, science education. We should have different streams. Not everybody is equipped for grammar school, as in the UK. Some people are equipped for comprehensive, some people are equipped for technical colleges, and I think that's what we need to look at. But I agree that we should pivot away from the colonial concept of teaching European-minded education.
Yeah, I've got a question for you. Sorry, you go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, please.
My next question, especially for Warimu to perhaps comment a little bit on, yes, also I agree with technology, with cell phones all over the place. But these cell phones are really not technology. They are a finished product of technology. Technology is an idea. So to what extent is the proliferation of these imported material a reflection of technology existence in African countries? That's something that always bothers me, whether it is computers or caterpillars, or we don't know how to maintain them because we are not party to producing them. Yes, we produce tantalite in the DRC that goes into the cell phone, but we don't produce the actual, if you will, DNA that gives us the finished product.
Thank you, Professor Kelechi. Thank you, Professor Kelechi. That is a loaded question in the sense that what I like about the proliferation of mobile technology, especially in Africa, is the access to information and the access to information and the exposure that has been brought about by the access to technology, by the access to the mobile phones to technology. The fact that you do not feel any different, the fact that people see the Black Lives Matter movement and actually say, well, this is relevant to Africa, the fact that we're able to have this webinar, The other thing about technology about that kind of access to the mobile phone that I've seen is the fact that there is more use of that technology for more innovation. So for instance, with the mobile phones, there are companies that advise that proliferate information to farmers through SMS, what kind of insecticides to use, the weather patterns, when to plant. Mobile, Safaricom is now, I think, the biggest banker. M-Pesa is the biggest banker in Kenya and maybe in East Africa. M-Pesa transactions are half the GDP of Kenya, were half the GDP of Kenya in 2019, more now. And the last thing is that they encourage innovation because you're able to research and innovate, and you're able to say, if this can be made in China or in the US, why can't we make it in Africa? And we are seeing that in Rwanda from Mara phones, right? And the issue that is going to lead up to my question is governance. Part of governance is regulation. A lot of technology, a lot of innovation is being stifled because of either a lack of regulation or an over-regulation when you seek regulation. So I do believe, yes, it is not representative of the technology potential that we have in Africa, but it's a great step forward because it provides the tools, the channels through which the young people especially can be able to foster their innovation. There are a lot of young people, university students who are now entrepreneurs. They run businesses just on their mobile phone. That would not have happened before. So there is more that needs to be done to encourage the actual production of the technological equipment. And it's encouraging that it is actually happening in garages in Kenya, in small cottage industries in Kenya and East Africa, and on a larger scale in countries like Rwanda that have actually licensed a mobile phone company to build a mobile phone in Africa. And that leads me, if I may, Ijeoma, to my question to Olabisi, Professor Olabisi and Dr. Funke. To what extent do you feel we can foster better governance in Africa? So political development and better governance in Africa, because I feel that it is such a missing link to see the potential, to actually push the potential that Africa has. To what can be done aside from AOT, Kenyans on Twitter sending emails to World Bank? What can be done on an active scale? I hand it over to you, Professor Olabisi.
Okay, so I know you've asked both Ms. Sadekoyese and I, so I'll be happy to just give some reflection. First, I would like to say that I don't think there's a magic wand to dealing with this type of issues. Governance by itself is a product of many aspects of a society working together the way they should be. And so we start from the basic things, and Ms. Sadekoya said it so well. What is the curriculum like in our schools, right? At what level do we start engaging our students and our citizens, particularly broadly, in the history of our society? The history of our society for what it is, not the abbreviated version of how when Nigeria happened, not why it came to be, not what Nigeria or the people, the region was before it was constituted as Nigeria and so on. So that's one part, right? Education as per curriculum, the value of history in curriculum, but history that is taught from a very critical lens, right? That questions ideas. But that also has a dimension of the attitude of educators towards education. It is the norm in Nigeria that students do not, and I don't know about Kenya and other parts of Africa, but it's probably true. Our educators don't like to be questioned, right? Their words are yea and amen, so to say. Their notes from 1962 is the law on the subject of evidence, right? As footnoted by one or more recent cases from the Supreme Court. So the attitude of educators, and I'm not one to bash, but these are very realistic. Once we leave the academic issues, so this is being practical about it now, that needs to be done to encourage ideas to thrive. If we say, Nigerians leave Nigeria, Africans leave their countries to different parts of the world, is because there is a system that allows them to develop those ideas, right? And so what you see is this bottom-up thinking about value systems as well, right? I say to my children very young, and I say, we sang songs that praised the value of truthfulness, the value of hard work, and the reward that comes from it as you grow up. And those were things I grew up on. And so the idea that you can get rich overnight, or that wealth by way of money is the only thing you think about in life, is very foreign to me as an individual, to be honest with you, because I just think money will happen over time. So it's not a thought whether I'll have money. It is what I must do to generate that, right? It's an end product. And so value system, corruption is linked to that as well. And it's not only a function of the law. So these are just some thoughts. There are many things I can speak to, but I think once we're thinking about better governance, it's an aggregate of all of these societal factors, because those in power came from the society. And so we can't say change the government, change the legislature, change that. Those will have some roles in terms of structure and frameworks, but the people and who they are is what's critical in my view.
Obviously, could you just clarify this part? Because for me, there's a contradiction here. Initially, it talks about colonialism, and it also went on to say Africa's solutions should be for Africa. African solutions should be for African continent. At the same time, talking about the educators now. So there is a different divergence there. On one part, you're saying Africans should stick with African solutions. On the other part, you're also saying, example, the educators who teach things that were taught 1962 and give no room for expansion or for new ideas. So how do you reconcile the two here? Because there seems to be some divergence there. So just clarify that part for me, please. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I understand. If Mr. Adekoya does not mind, because that question was posed to both of us. So I'll just okay, man. So I'll just quickly say, that the point here is not contradictory, right? There are various lines that run simultaneously in society, right? But are seriously interconnected. So the colonial point is, for example, I'll speak of myself. When I went through education in Nigeria, where I got, which I'm proud of, got my LLB, there was nothing about, questioning colonialism. Even in social studies, in high school, you were just given, it was just as if that's knowledge, that is, right? You didn't engage with them by way of questioning. Now, if we were taught in a different way, just by saying, how did this come to be? Why is this so? Must this be so, right? Then it leads you to the point I've made around the legacies of colonialism, right? About the fact that, well, we're just crying on as though the system we had is the system we have, is the system we've always had, which connects to Mr. Adekoya's point about, us thinking about how did this system of liberal democracy come to us? Is it really the most effective system? How do you expect a man or woman who grew up for 50 years, for example, under military, or 30, 45 years with intermittent, civilian roles in it there, under military administrator, to suddenly be that person who obeys the law, quote unquote? So there are so many social explanations. I'm not a sociologist, but you do see the interconnection between this kind of interdisciplinary thinking to understanding why society works the way they work. What makes a man obey to stay on the line at the airport in Heathrow, and things just as the plane is about to land in Lagos, he or she can make a call while the plane is still airborne, right? So it's not just the law. There's a social understanding and making of that person that we are striking at. And if you see, just to use an example, and I'll stop, informality in how we deal with corruption today. There are so many studies being conducted saying, look, laws do not solve corruption. I've written about this. If we have practitioners here, you go to places, sometimes you're surprised at the networks, informal networks of corruption, where Mr. A knows to go to Miss B, to go to Miss C, and the law does not capture that. But how do you deal with that? So these questions are not easy. That's why I said it's Wairimu. It's not, I don't have a solution, but we've discussed ideas that I think if we start implementing across various facets of society and life, then we're sure to see over time the benefits of this. But there has to be simultaneous top-down and bottom-up dealing with this. We're not just waiting for the next generation to grow to deal with these issues.
Thanks for the clarification. I guess with time, we're coming to the end of this session. I want some closing remarks from everyone, from all the panelists. So could you give us your 2 seconds closing remarks? Is there something like that? 2 seconds or a minute? Funka Dekoya, please.
I thank everyone for their perseverance in staying with us this long. I hope that the discussions that we've had generate more discussion, more thought as to how we can bring development to Africa.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Kelechi, please.
It really has been a privilege to be part of the panel. I have gathered more knowledge. I hope the listeners have as well, and carry on the conversation. I will just end by saying, yes, education is important, but we also need to think more specifically about the kind of education that will enhance our development, because everyone tends to think science. Well, science, the method of verification, the measurement is often the measure of verification. So the instrument rather is often used to verify whether you have found scientific knowledge or not. If our schools and our students are not familiar with the tools of measurement, then connecting with the science education is going to be extremely difficult. We need to contextualize our curriculum to our different localities. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Wairimu, please.
Asante Sana. Thank you for inviting me and for joining us. My closing remarks is going to be the fact that COVID-19, I feel, has had a bad effect on Africa, but it has also been the silver lining that has come in for us as Africans to find our identity. In the words of Fela Kuti and in the words of His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, we have our identity. Let us use the tools, the lessons from COVID-19, especially, in my view, information technology in education, access to information technology in access to good governance and in questioning governance. We have the tools, we have the power, and that has been a great lesson for me in light of the pandemic. We are each other. We can be very secluded from the world, as we saw from the pandemic. Let us reach out to each other and let us proliferate the use of information technology, especially in finding our identity and doing great things on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you. Olabisi, please.
Yeah, and just to say thank you very much to the panelists. If you're watching this now that it is recorded, I hope it generates some interest to not just engage with the thoughts that have been shared, but also moves you to action in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all the panelists, and thanks for an informative session. It's on YouTube. can go back and watch it much later. To everyone, I say Happy African Day and enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are in the world. And bye to everyone. Thank you. And to Asil, a big thank you. To James, Tenner, thanks a lot for all the help. We appreciate. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ijeoma.
Thank you so much, Funke. Thank you, Kelechi. Thank you, Olabisi. Thank you, Warimu. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Funke, I now know where to find you when I'm in trouble in Lagos. So I'll come to your chambers.
Come with the big box.